It is your Friday daily delivery. I am Michael Rand. Glad to be back for final show of the week. Hope everyone's having a good one out there. As good as possible in light of what happened on Thursday. Timberwolves lose 124-103. Final score actually feels a little bit generous given the flow of the game against Dallas at Target Center. Game 5, the loss, 4-1 series loss. Season over. Wolves lose the series 4-1, Western Conference Finals. It was there for the taking like a week ago, right? It just felt like so recently that series was there for the taking, that the Wolves were favored. First 2 at home, close games in the first 4. That to have it end this way doesn't quite feel fair, doesn't quite feel right, but that is the way it ends. I will spend a lot of time on that here in just a minute. Rest of the show, definitely worth listening to as well. Jon Marthaler joins me to talk Minnesota United soccer. Emanuel Reynoso, gone. Interesting there. John and I will get into that a little bit, as well as just kind of the start to the season, which has been generally overwhelmingly positive, although some scripts being flipped a little bit in the last game and a half for the Loons. John and I will talk about that here, like I said, just a minute or so. Then we'll get into a little bit at the end of the show on what comes next. What do you turn your attention to if you've had Wolves fever, even if you've had PWHL mania? What do you do with yourself now that the calendar flips to June here pretty soon, just tomorrow? So we'll get into that at the end of the show. First, though, what I missed, like I said, spending a lot of time going deep on the Wolves, not worthy of a special episode off of that game 5, but worthy of kind of a dissection of not so much the game itself, right? Like that game was pretty much over before it started, wasn't it? You watched it, you were like, okay. For me, it was Luka Doncic hitting a couple early threes. It was like, okay, the Wolves were kind of in it. They were just kind of like feeling each other out. Then Luka just like splashed a couple threes. And you're like, okay, Luka came to play tonight. And then Kyrie Irving was doing his thing early. All of a sudden, it was like, okay, you look up the score. It's like 30-18. Then Dallas just got on like a 10-0 run. Felt fast. Felt like it got out of hand quickly, right? Like at one minute, you're sitting there thinking, oh man, Wolves might have a chance to make history, right? They won Game 4 in Dallas. You're like, could they make history? Got to come back strong in Game 5. Got to win on your home court. Maybe they can blow Dallas out. That was what Chris Hine and I talked about on Thursday's show. Hey, maybe they can blow Dallas out, not take this down to the wire, feel good about themselves. Instead, it is Dallas blowing them out. Didn't really give themselves much of a chance. I don't know if it was energy. I don't know if it was Dallas gets up big and all of a sudden the adrenaline is gone. All of a sudden you're like, oh man, it's been a long season. These guys have played, close to 100 games at this point in the season. If you've gone through regular season, 11 games in the first 2 rounds, another 4 before this. That's like 97 games before this game was played. That is a lot of games on the odometer. And these guys aren't used to that, right? I think KG, I heard KG on his podcast the other day talking about that, just like how you got to train through July 1st. That was like a Michael Jordan thing. You got to train through July 1st. Even if you're not going to the finals, you got to train that deep so that when you get to this moment, you're ready for it. The Wolves, I don't know if they ran out of gas, what it was, but they just didn't quite seem like themselves in this Dallas series. I think Denver series took a lot out of them. It's not like that was their finals, but if you think about it, like a lot of their construction was set up to beat the Nuggets, right? To beat Denver, to be a team that could neutralize or at least, control the game against Nikola Jokic, so they could, have some answers against his excellence. And obviously he had his moments in the middle of that series, but by and large, the Wolves did enough against him and against their supporting cast with all their big bodies, all their length, all their, all that they bring to the table. They were built, Tim Connolly knew exactly how to construct Denver, but he also knew how to construct Minnesota to beat Denver. Along comes Dallas, though. Totally different animal, totally different construction, a team kind of like finding its identity on the fly this season. We knew Luka and Kyrie were the backbone of this team, but they add Gafford at the trade deadline, add PJ Washington. All of a sudden, they've got all this length. They've got this kind of synergy to them where it's like all these pieces make sense. And this is not a team set up to beat Dallas. Now, at the beginning of this series, I thought it was. I looked at it, I was like, okay, Luka and Kyrie are amazing, right? These guys are some of the best shooters, shot makers, creators in the game. You put two of those on the same team, it's not fair. But the Wolves can throw a lot of good perimeter defenders at you. You can throw Jaden McDaniels, obviously. You throw Anthony Edwards, who's a very good on-ball defender. You throw off the bench, Nickeil Alexander-Walker off the bench. You throw a lot of good defenders individually. You throw Mike Conley's, experience in there. You got a lot of guys who can defend. You got Rudy Gobert in the middle, defensive player of the year. It's like I thought, okay, if any team can kind of neutralize these guys, make Dallas' supporting cast work, it is this team. And instead, Dallas shows that they are just the wrong matchup at the wrong time for the Timberwolves. Now, I think Chris Finch, Timberwolves coach, said at the end of the Denver series, like how they managed to kind of muster up the resolve to come back, win Game 6 after they'd lost 3 in a row, win Game 7 after they were down 20. Like he just kept harping on him. He was like, guys, our best is better than their best. I think that was absolutely true. It's a very poignant quote from that series. When the Wolves were at their best in that Denver series, the Wolves were in control of that series. Now, granted, I don't think we saw the Wolves at their best nearly enough in this series, but I will say this. Dallas's best in this series, at least, maybe not, in a vacuum, in a perfect world, in the regular season, whatever you want to say, maybe not in that, but in this series, Dallas's best was clearly better than the Wolves' best. I think we showed that in the clutch moments in games 1, 2, and 3, and you certainly showed it over the duration, first 3 quarters at least, of Game 5 when they just took control of this thing and wouldn't let go. So Dallas's best. Dallas, erased all doubt. Dallas deserved to win this series. Like I said, I don't think the Timberwolves played their best, but Dallas certainly deserved to win this series. I feel bad for the Target Center crowd. I feel bad because there was this opportunity, right? Like the belief was rekindled when the Wolves won Game 4. It's like, okay, they're not just going away. They've got some fight left in them. They got this talk like, hey, let's make history. Let's be the first team to come back from an 0-3 deficit, 0-155. Nobody had ever done it. Let's be the first team. Instead, the Wolves are 0-156, just another stat along that speed bump along that stat. But Wolves don't get it done, but they had that belief. They've rekindled that belief at Target Center, and the Target Center crowd was such an important part of this season, such an important part of this playoff run. Like the joy of this year cannot be understated. And that doesn't go away just because you get routed in Game 5, right? That doesn't go away. It leaves a bad taste, like how it finished, but I do believe that this season was still special. You go to the conference finals for the first time in 20 years. You make a playoff run. You got, all these guys getting individual awards. Naz Reid, everybody loves Naz Reid, getting him 6th man of the year. Rudy Gobert, defensive player of the year. Mike Conley, teammate of the year. Ant gets 2nd team All-NBA. Cat's an All-Star again. Of course, Ant is too. Chris Finch in the running for, coach of the year. Like all these individual parts, but the team itself, people really bought into this team. So I feel bad for the way it ended for the folks who had to watch the way it ended, because I don't think it was a fitting end. I think it was deserved because Dallas was just that good in Game 5. They deserved to have their moment, but I wish it would have been different for the Target Center crowd. Even like a loss by like 8, where you're like, okay, hey, wasn't their night, happens, but to get blown out, I don't feel like that was the fitting end to this season. But all seasons do have to come to an end. This one came to an end with a thud. That happens in history. We've seen that from Minnesota teams in the past, but I look at this and say didn't feel like it was exactly fair to them, to all the people who've supported this team, that it ended quite the way it did. But it ended that way, and that's, you can't take that away from anything. And of course, now you move on to the big two things to kind of leave you with. One, you never know, right? You never know when you are going to get back to this moment again. I know people have high hopes for this franchise. I know this is a team that has a lot of their best players under contract. More on that in a minute. This looks like a team on the rise. Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Karl Anthony Towns under contract, Rudy Gobert under contract, Conley under contract still. A lot of the supporting cast, Naz Reid under contract, like a lot of their best players coming back for more next season, presumably, if they are all back. And again, more on that in a minute. So if everybody comes back, the assumption is, hey, pick up right where you left off, right? At 56 wins, got the playoff run, swept Phoenix, showed the resolve against Denver, didn't get it done against Dallas, but sometimes you got to go through those battles to get better, right? You got to go through those battles to get better. That said, history is also littered with teams that thought they would get back, teams that thought they would get back to, that opportunity. These opportunities, every season is its own animal. You never know who is going to be great next year. You never know what's going to happen this offseason. You don't know how good Oklahoma City is going to be next year. You don't know how great Dallas still might be next year. You don't know what Denver might retool itself to be next year. You don't know what the Lakers are going to do next year. Like, you just don't know what the swirl of the 2024-25 season and beyond brings to this. So treating it like, hey, this is just the first of many, that's good. That's optimistic. You should think that way. You should have that belief, but none of this is guaranteed. There is no guarantee they get back to this stage. There's no guarantee they get to the finals. There's no guarantee they win a championship just because they got to this moment. So that is important. So what does it take to get beyond this moment? That is the roster assessment that has to happen this offseason. Now, that is the big question. That's the biggest question going into this offseason. How do they handle salary questions? How do they handle kind of complementary pieces in a more complex salary structure? You get the new collective bargaining rules coming into play. How they kind of maneuver that. Are they willing to be a tax team? Are they willing to pay tens of millions of dollars in luxury tax to keep this team together? You could argue that going to the Western Conference Finals shows that they are worthy of keeping this core intact, and I think that's a good starting point. But how ownership feels, who ownership even is after arbitration, after all this happens, that's another question for another day. But how that all shakes out is an interesting question for how this roster gets put together. But I think the bigger takeaway is, like, how do you add to this? How do you think about, can you keep this all together? Are you willing to pay to keep this all together? And if you are, how do you add to this? What are the missing ingredients? Is it just experience and time? You might think so. You might hope so. That might be the answer. I think that's part of the answer. If you are looking deeper, though, I think one thing this team was sorely missing was a second perimeter creator whenever Anthony Edwards wasn't on the floor, or even when he was. Love Mike Conley Jr., but he's a complimentary player. He is cerebral. He can still shoot. He is a perfect fit for this team, but he doesn't have that kind of secondary he's not the secondary guy. I don't think Jaden McDaniels is ever going to be quite that secondary guy. He's a complementary piece. How do you find someone on the perimeter, a sixth man kind of guy? Again, Naz Reid, sixth man of the year. I'm not saying they don't have a sixth man. I'm saying sixth man of the year who can handle the ball, who can create his own shot, who can take a little bit of that pressure valve off of Anthony Edwards. They put a lot on Ant's plate as a 22-year-old. He was on the court all the time. Whenever he was off the court, which wasn't frequent, he was top 10 in minutes in the NBA this year. Whenever he was off the court, it felt like, where's the offense going to come from? Who is going to create this offense? And it's not like it wasn't possible. Like, Towns is a gifted offensive player. Naz Reid, gifted offensive player. Enough offense with this team to withstand that, but they're kind of built around defense. And if the defense isn't there, where is the offense coming from? So I think they need to search that question in the offseason. How do they take a little bit of the pressure, at least on the perimeter, off of Anthony Edwards within their salary structure? Does that mean they can keep everybody? Does that mean they have to slightly retool this? Is Karl Anthony Towns still a potential trade candidate? I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know how they approach this. Cat wasn't the problem in Game 5. He was fine. Cat wasn't the problem in Game 4. He had some struggles early in the series. He absolutely was a key performer for them in more often than not in the first and second round. So he answered a lot of the questions. Didn't answer all of the questions, but he answered a lot of the questions about, can you trust him? But do they look at this and say, man, got Rudy Gobert, got Naz Reid, do you need some different ingredients in place? Can you find a different balance? Is there a different way to go about this and still feel like you are building towards excellence? I don't know. It's a fascinating offseason. It's a great season. Second best year in Wolves history. I still don't think this is as good as the team 20 years ago. That team was a Sam Cassell injury away from going to the finals. I firmly believe that. This team had all its health. It had all the guys you could want to playing. Maybe some guys were banged up. We'll probably find out about that later, but everybody that they could have wanted on the court was on the court. That was not an excuse here. That team 20 years ago had the MVP, KG, that was a special season. That was a better team, but this is right up there. It's like it's the 1A and 1B. It's just a little bit less because of the way it finished, but this is a team worthy of that, and this is certainly a team potentially that can go further in those in the future years. That team was kind of like turned out to be a one-hit wonder. It all fell apart the next year, and then it all fell apart for good for most of the next 20 years. But now you have this team that's got this potential, that's got this opportunity to maybe build on that. Where that goes from here, what they do this offseason, who they draft. They got a first-round pick. They got 2 top 40 picks. Who they draft, how that factors into it. Do they package that in a trade? Do they try to get better with other blockbuster trades? I don't know. I don't know what Tim Conley's thinking. I don't know who's going to own the team. That's a big question too. I know this. This team went further than I thought they would. They exceeded my preseason expectations by a lot. They answered a lot of questions this year about their future direction. I think they deserve the chance to keep a lot of this intact, but I also think they have a lot of questions to ask about how this looks going forward. It's going to be a fascinating offseason. It was a great season. It was a joy. It was fun to watch. It didn't end the way anybody with the Wolves would have wanted it to end, but you can't take away from the totality of what this season was.
Royal Credit Union's Smart Checking accounts offer no monthly fees and no minimum balance. Enjoy financial freedom when you open your Royal Credit Union Smart Checking account online at rcu.org/go-checking. Insured by NCUA.
Let's talk a little Minnesota United soccer today with Jon Marthaler. He's been doing a lot of Loons coverage for the Star Tribune. He's been writing about soccer and other things for quite some time. John, how are you?
Not too bad. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing pretty good. I think the last time we talked, the Loons were on a pretty good roll, and it seemed like it had continued, but then a tough set of circumstances, right? A midweek game out at LA, and they take a result that maybe isn't all that surprising, but was it? What did you take away from their game out at LAFC?
Well, they went out to LAFC and they lost, which is not in itself surprising. I actually looked it up last night when I was writing a little bit. LAFC has the best home record in Major League Soccer history, and it's actually not particularly close. Even if you just restrict that to 2018 and later, LAFC came into the league in 2018. They still have the best home record in MLS. So in an age when travel has gotten easier, the teams take charter flights now rather than flying commercial and stuff like that. So travel's gotten easier, but it's still the hardest place to win in MLS history. So losing 2-0 at LAFC in and of itself is not a big deal. And what I sort of wrote about in the analysis that just went up, StarTribune.com.
Hey, good synergy right there.
what I sort of wrote about was up until halftime on Saturday against Colorado, it kind of looked like the Loons might be championship kind of material. They were winning 3-1 at halftime against Colorado. It was going to be their third consecutive road win. There was going to be their sixth consecutive game undefeated, and I think people could be forgiven a little bit from looking at the standings and going, just how far behind Inter Miami are they right now?
Right?
Like,
Yeah.
are they? They're not. They've got games in hand on Real Salt Lake. Are they the best team in the Western Conference? Right. But they in the second half against Colorado, they gave up a couple of goals. Dane St. Clair saved a penalty in there. So honestly, they were lucky to get out of Colorado with a point, and then they go and get pretty comprehensively handled in Los Angeles. These things in and of themselves are not terrible things. It's hard to win at Colorado. It's hard to win at Los Angeles. It just it pumped the brakes a little bit on sort of the gathering momentum of the Loons might be the best team in the Western Conference.
Should we assume it's what's the problem? Is it defensive breakdown that kind of is costing them in the last 135 minutes? Is it a little bit of everything? Like what's the change there?
It was Eric Ramsey was his post-game press conference after the LA game. It was the word he kept using over and over was precision, imprecision. Those two forms of the word, just talking about how the Loons weren't as precise as they could be, didn't use the ball very well. They gave the ball away a ton. I had people on social media who were saying things like, I know the Loons don't complete a lot of passes, but I think it would help if they didn't complete all their passes to the other team.
Sure.
And I think they had sort of set a standard that over the past couple of games that they weren't quite living up to. Now, some of that is natural. That happens to a lot of teams, but certainly I think they're looking for a little bit more in terms of being able to control the ball and control the game. Again, against Colorado, they ended up with, depending on where you looked, between the second fewest and fifth fewest completed passes in MLS history in a game. Wow. So that gives you some idea of how little they were on the ball and how little they did with it when they did have it. That said, they also scored 3 goals in 33 minutes. So
it's a tactic. It's a strategy.
You can never exactly look and say the team with the most completed passes is going to win the game. That's simply not true. Those two things have no correlation to each other because there's so many different ways to win a soccer game. But it is representative of how they were going on the road and trying to win a game.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So where, they had to play a midweek game. I don't remember there being a ton of those so far, but I imagine that, creeps up a little bit more, and they have to make lineup decisions, roster decisions as a result of that. How does something even just as simple as a Wednesday match either stretch them, test them, give them a different kind of look as opposed to, when you could get into the once a week kind of cadence that they've been on at certain points too?
Yeah, they've spoken a lot about how they want to have a deep squad, a big squad where they play a lot of guys. And true to form, they have regularly played somewhere between 16 and 18 guys. I don't have the number in front of me, but I bet that they probably have about 18 guys who have 300, 400, 500 or more minutes this year. I think when you get into the weeks like this one, where they have 3 games in 8 days, it becomes a little bit hard to sort of strike a balance between we're going to play a lot of guys and these guys on this hand are really playing well versus these guys are not playing well. Ramsey has said a lot that he wants to build a team not around a certain way that they have to play, but he wants to build a team around the players that are available and the players that are in form. The problem is those two things are not always the same thing in terms of, when you're playing once a week, it's a little bit easier to say, all right, we're going to play the following guys, and then these guys are going to play a half hour and just sort of be the second unit. Now they're into a thing where they've got to chop and change a little bit and figure out how they're going to marry playing fewer minutes, especially with the amount of running that some of their guys are getting through versus who can actually play well right now.
So they're doing all this without Emanuel Reynoso. He's played like 30 minutes all year, and we finally learned Thursday that he's been transferred to Club Tijuana, no longer with Minnesota United, ending the tenure. One of their greatest players, probably the greatest player in Loons history. Was this the logical end to his tenure?
Yeah, I think this was always the way it was going to end after he skipped that green card appointment and then took 2 months to get back to Minnesota. I think they've been pretty clear this whole season that what they were looking for was for guys to buy in, and then if people weren't going to buy in, then they were going to move forward without him. And you saw that just in the tenor of how their public statements and their willingness to talk about Reynoso changed. In past years, there was a lot of talk and a lot of willingness to communicate and work with him. And this year, once he didn't do what they asked him to do, it was just over. And you saw that from the way that everyone talked about him, from going from people saying that they didn't want to talk about him to Michael Boxall, who after he came back to Minnesota, we asked Michael Boxall how he felt about Emanuel Reynoso being back and whether it was a distraction. He said, not at all. Haven't seen him. Out of sight, out of mind. And on the one hand, that's a strange thing to say about a guy who is maybe your most talented player, but everyone had just moved on. So this was the logical outcome that eventually they were just going to move on without him. And I sort of wrote this, but it really seemed like it was down to two options. Either they were going to sell him or they were just going to straight up buy him out. And it sounds like they've gone with the sales route, and they got something for him, and I think they have to consider that a win.
Given all of his accomplishments, but then also given kind of everything that's happened the last couple of years, how do you think Reynoso's teammates, fans, how will they remember his time in Minnesota?
I don't know about teammates necessarily, but from a fan perspective, it almost feels like this is a good thing in the sense that now that they can remember the good times a little bit, you can sort of put aside the annoyance and the anger that fans have probably felt about this whole Reynoso situation after last year's situation. You sort of saw it last year when Reynoso finally came back from his absence in, I think it was right at the start of June when he finally hit the field again. Fans were very excited, very warm. The huge ovations, huge applause. They were just happy to have him back. It was never completely clear to the public, I don't think, why he had missed the first part of 2023, and fans were just happy to have him back. That was definitely not the case this time around. Once he did it again, fans were just sort of tired of it. The responses that people sent to me on social media and stuff were mostly of the form of good riddance. We've had enough. We don't need any of this. And so I think now that there's finally an end on it and there's finally sort of a bow on it, I think now people can go back and remember, you know what? It was pretty awesome when he came in 2020 and had 9 assists in 3 playoff games. I can't even remember the numbers. It was an unbelievable run. And even the few years after that, he was an all-star one year. He was one of the best players in MLS and one of the most fun players to watch in MLS. He was sort of a throwback to a different time of number 10, that attacking midfielder role that just sort of pulled all the strings. And you could go a long ways in watching European soccer and stuff like that without seeing any players like Reynoso, because they had sort of come out of the game a little bit, and it was a throwback to a little bit of a time, something that people love watching. People have always loved watching guys who pull the strings in that number 10 role, and Reynoso was as good at it as any player in MLS, and it was really fun to watch. And I think people can remember that now rather than the last couple of years where it was like, oh my goodness, what is wrong with this guy? Why can't he show up? So I think that'll be a positive for fans. As far as teammates, the way everybody seems to operate is they just move forward, and I think they've already had plenty of practice this year with just moving forward without Reynoso, and I think that'll be exactly what they have to say going forward as well.
What's the kind of national narrative around this team? I mean, maybe even I imagine it shifted a little bit with these last, 1.5 results, but have they been capturing people's imaginations, just beyond the diehards here and, some of the people that follow it pretty closely here?
I think the national narrative around Minnesota this year has been to be impressed with what they've done without Reynoso and with also getting almost nothing from Teemu Pukki. Those are their 2 highest paid players. Reynoso's been gone. Teemu Pukki now hasn't scored for 11 consecutive games that he's played in. He had 2 goals against Orlando in I think that was the third game of the season, and he hasn't scored since. He started last night. He had right before he got subbed off in about the 63rd minute, there was a ball that sort of fell to him, a deflected cross, and he could have gotten a shot on goal, and instead it went right through his legs and out of play. That's just sort of a microcosm for how his whole season has gone. He can't get out of his own way right now, and so Minnesota, the national narrative is sort of, it has always been, well, they have Reynoso and Pukki, they'll be fine. Now they don't have Reynoso and Pukki, and they're farther towards the top of the standings than they ever have been. So I think there's a lot of people who are impressed with what Minnesota's done. Taylor Twellman, who's one of the bigger MLS voices, he said that Eric Ramsey is the no doubt coach of the year, and he hasn't even been there for the whole year.
Right.
So that sort of gives you some idea of how people nationally are just looking at this team and going, I don't know how they're doing it, but they're doing it.
And should that be gratifying or worrying to them, basically, that there's kind of this sense of, like, how are they doing it? Does it feel like it could come crashing down? Or is it just, the longer they've done it, even, these last, couple games notwithstanding, does it feel more sustainable at that point?
Well, I think it's gratifying. I think whether you see it as gratifying or worrying depends on how much you believe in Khalid Al-Ahmad's ability to build the team when it gets to summer in the transfer window.
Okay.
There's certainly, if they do get rid of Reynoso, they have the ability to bring in another designated player. They could also potentially buy down. I'm doing finger quotes, obviously.
Yeah.
Listeners can't see the finger quotes, but buy down Robin Lod's contract so that he's no longer a designated player either. So potentially that's two designated player spots. I don't know if they necessarily would look at it and go, yeah, we got to make a big swing. Let's bring in two paid players this summer. But I do think that they've set themselves up so they have a little bit of flexibility in terms of what they can do. And so I think whether you are excited or worried depends on how much you believe they can sort of continue to build this and continue to make changes.
Well, the offseason narrative was what a mess, right? Like, hey, they brought everybody in late. Like, Ramsey's not even starting the season as manager. He's getting up to speed. Like, they seem to have put that in the rearview mirror pretty quickly with how well they've played so far. And, maybe that's a lesson that some of that stuff doesn't matter as much, or that the patient model works, or maybe it's just that maybe it's good. It's probably good for them that narrative disappeared quickly, I guess is what I would say.
They said all along in the offseason, we want to get the right people. We're not going to rush. And a lot of other people said, okay, I think you're crazy. You need to have a coach.
Couldn't you do both?
Have a general manager.
Could you get the right people
Why
and
not?
on the right timeline? Could you?
I mean, they even fired Adrian Heath with 2 games to go in last season. And I thought, I see what they're doing here. They're going to fire him because they want to move quickly. They want to use this offseason well. They didn't do that. It doesn't matter. Apparently, it doesn't matter. Every other team, this maybe goes through all professional sports teams. You don't need a coach. You don't need anything. I mean, look at PWHL Minnesota. They got a new coach like the day of the season, hours before the season started. They got a new coach. Everything is fine. Who cares who your coach is? Who cares who your general manager is? Once the season starts, you can figure all that out. That's clearly the truth here.
Well, and that's funny, too, because I kind of wrote about that and just the narratives that we create, we being the media, or even just fans, like the things we fixate on. And I wrote about kind of the context of momentum, and like we worry so much about, this team is ice cold. No way can they win this game. Like PWHL Minnesota, lost 7 games in a row, 5 to end the regular season, 2 by shutout at the start of the playoffs. Like they logically, at least how we look at these things logically, they had no business then going on to win a championship. But athletes are different, right? Like teams who are in this and are playing, who are putting together these teams, who are largely, have some experience at the higher levels of competition. They just have this utmost faith in either their own abilities to play or their own abilities to kind of out scheme or outsmart everybody, that they don't really believe in momentum. They just think, we lost. We're going to win tomorrow no matter what.
It's fascinating to me looking at the difference between how professional athletes experience doing things and how we as fans experience watching those things.
100%.
Because fans are going to look at Colorado and LAFC and look at those 3 halves. And this is even sort of what I wrote about for StarTribune.com. It's sort of pumping the brakes on everything. But I know that if I talk to any Minnesota United players, they're not going to see it like that at all. They're going to see it as blips on the radar, one-offs that can be explained away and it can't be replicated. And so while fans are suffering, like PWHL Minnesota went through one of the most painful losses I've ever seen in pro sports, having thrown their sticks and celebrated winning the championship in Game 4, seeing it waved off, giving up a goal a minute later. That was devastating for fans.
It should have been.
And for the players, it didn't matter. They shut out Boston on the road in Game 5.
It did in the moment. Like, you could see they were we probably were a little bit rattled in the moment. They gave up a quick goal after that. But coming back for Game 5, it was like nothing ever happened. They were as good in Game 5 as you possibly could have been as a road team in a do or die game. And it just made no sense. Like, we think they should be devastated. They're just like, it happened, but we're great. We're going to come back and win again.
Yep. So I'm convinced momentum does not matter in pro sports, with the exception of in the NBA playoffs, where it's the only thing that matters. And therefore, the Timberwolves won Game 4 and are going to go on to win Game 5, 6, and 7 as well.
Well, this episode will drop after Game 5. We'll see if you are correct or not about that. Maybe we'll say stick to soccer. In any event, John, appreciate the time as always, and we'll catch up soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Great stuff from Jon Marthaler. Appreciate him joining me on this show. Loons are a team to watch, right? Like the last couple, last match and a half notwithstanding, this is a team that's been surprising this year, even with Reynoso gone now. They've been fine without him. They should be fine without him going forward. This is a team that could be worth watching, could be worth could be a contender when the season ends. And that kind of brings me to the final point of the show, the cooler. What do we do now that the Wolves are done, right? Like, what? They've occupied so much of our headspace for the last month and a half. Not just me. I'm not just saying the royal we here. Like, everybody. Like, this playoff run started like mid-April, right? Like, that's when the play-in started. You're like, who are the Wolves? We knew they were playing the Suns, but like, what's this whole thing going to look like? It's been like a month and a half since that all started. All of a sudden, it comes to a halt. You're never really ready for it, but like, what do you turn your attention to now? A couple things. Obviously, the Loons. I think the Lynx are going to be really good this year. I know they just lost to Las Vegas the other day. Vegas really good. Not worried too much about that, although, big picture that could be troublesome. But the Lynx look like they are in a good spot. Twins won again over the Royals. Big series against the Royals. Some, a comeback in that game. Ryan Jeffers, huge offensive game. Kind of overcame some shaky pitching early. A comeback win. So that team, if they can establish some consistency, if they can figure out kind of how to avoid those like more serious dips, like 7 losses in a row where they get outscored, I think 45-12. Like, how do you explain that away and then kind of come back and just play really well for a week? Like, I don't understand how that happens, but if they can find that equilibrium, find like, good more often than not, instead of like hot, cold, that could be a team to watch again this summer. Coming off their first, playoff win, first playoff series win in a couple decades. Last year, Royce Lewis on the verge of returning. That's exciting too. So that team could be heating up as you turn your attention from Target Center to Target Field. That's worth watching. Vikings minicamp next week starts Tuesday. Justin Jefferson, the big storyline there. Does he show up? What does he look like? When is he going to sign an extension? That's a big deal. J.J. McCarthy, rookie quarterback. What's he looking like? How's J.J. looking? Let's start that. How's J.J. looking? We had the how's Teddy looking for a long time. How's J.J. looking? Got all that to look forward to. So Twins, Lynx, Loons, Vikings. We always find a way. Wolves off season. There'll be plenty of fodder there. Draft is only 3-4 weeks away. They actually have draft picks this year, so that's fun. Wild off season, something to watch there. How they're going to retool kind of going into the last year of the Suter and Parisi buyouts. So there's always something. There's always something for you to turn your attention to. You don't have to turn the page immediately. You can kind of soak in, bask in this Wolf season. Didn't end, like I said, the way you wanted it to, but a great year nonetheless. And plenty of Minnesota sports to look forward to as the summer goes along. That will do it for me today. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Royce with me on Monday, I am sure. Back at it then. Until then, I'm Michael Rand. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you in a couple days.